Shalom, this is Nizama Shal Hamadabar Yasharal on my channel, Nizama the Hebrew Mystic Healer. Before I get started with this particular video, I want to go ahead and give a quick shout out to my 3D kin, the 12 tribes of Israel scattered to the four corners of this earth realm. Shalom to you. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my cosmic kin, scattered to the 12 dimensions of this universal egg matrix. Shalom to you as well. And as always, I want to give a quick shout out to the viewers and subscribers of my channel. If you are not yet subscribed to my channel, if you could subscribe now, you will be in the loop with all the cool stuff coming up. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. So, now that we got all that out of the way, I want to go ahead and let you guys know what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So, as you know, I have been speaking with my soul collective, the Niberu Council of Nine within the 8th dimension of Orion, resonate through that dimension rather. And I've been talking to these ancestors, this soul group, for a while now, but I've been more so asking more questions and, you know, getting more information, so to speak, about myself, about my mission, and about bigger things outside of myself. So in this particular instance, I was asking about the history, the real history of this particular universe and what's transpired, because there's a lot of narratives. There's a lot of narratives going around because of incursions and conquests, because of different people's views. Usually the people being conquered are forced to accept the views of the conquerors. And as we already know, there are people that, you know, have made a concerted effort to keep us from information. So that's basically what I'm going to do the video on today. I asked my soul collective, I asked the Council of Nine for basically their version of the history of this universe. So this is going to have to be split up into segments because it's a lot of information. And I usually don't like to go above like 25 minutes when I'm doing videos unless I'm doing interviews. So I'm going to try to keep it to like 20-25 minutes tops. So I already talked about this with my soul collective. So this is information I've already taken down in notes. So it's not going to be something that I'm going to be like channeling like right now, like in this video. It's information that I already received. So I'm just going to be sharing that information with you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the Niberu themselves, because this is from the perspective of that particular soul group, my soul group. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the brief history of them. And then I'm going to move into their version, basically, of the history of this particular universe, specifically the Earth. In future videos, I might concentrate more on what happened in the celestial realms, but for this particular video, and maybe a part 2, will be more focused on the Earth realm. So I just want to kind of get that out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So basically, the word Niberu means to cross over, as I've discussed in other videos I've done. So in the case of the actual Niberu collective or race, or what many have come to call the Anunnaki, based on the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the Niberu came out of the void. The word Niberu or Hebrew, both Shemitic languages, means to cross over. So the Niberu literally crossed over from the void into this particular universe, but not before creating universes. So I actually have memory of this. I've saw it played out. But basically, when we as a collective, and I'm going to probably use we and they interchangeably, so just letting you guys know that. When we as a collective emanated out of the void, we began creating universes and what I call soul stars or souls, based on what was emanating out. We were taking what was emanating out and creating with it. So basically, there was 400 of us that came out of the void. Well, actually, sorry, let me be more clear. There were 400 of us which embodied the universe out of the void. There were probably many more, but what I got is that there were 400 that came into the universe. So after we created universes, we wanted to start experiencing our own creation from within. And so what they did was we began to embody universes. So 400 of this Niberu Soul Collective basically embodied this particular universe. So when they did that, they emanated down through dimensions, and they chose to concentrate primarily in the areas of Orion, Draco, and also Sirius, and to an extent Lyra. But they set up home really in Orion, and this is in the 8th dimension. So because they still had their memories intact, when they came down in these dimensions, in these densities, they knew who they were. They knew they had created the universe itself that they came down and embodied into. Because of that, there was a tendency for them to, what I'm getting and what I really sensed was really to expect a degree of reverence, or expect a degree of respect and acknowledgement of their divinity, of them as creator gods. Because of that, there was issues with a lot of the other races that were here, because the universe, even in the higher dimensions, there's still time. A lot of people don't realize that. There is still time. It just moves much slower than it does here in this particular dimension. But I digress. Because time still moved and it moved slowly, to these beings, all they had ever known, these indigenous beings, these celestial realms, all they'd ever known is their own particular emanations or evolutions within the universal egg. They did not understand that they themselves had come, they were created essentially within the context of the universe, not within the context of source, but within the context of the universe. In the avatars that they had and the expressions that they were embodying, they were, essentially created by these Niberu. So there was this expectation from the Niberu for that kind of acknowledgement, which they did not receive. And what I'm getting is that the other beings just looked at them as these intruder races that were coming with this massive megalomania, like superiority complexes, expecting, devotion and worship and things of this nature. But they were more so looking for acknowledgement, and they were wanting to experience the universe. But what they were kind of not understanding, that they understood later, is that in order to truly experience the creation, you have to live out. It's like a role. You live out the role of that aspect or that emanation of creation. So you're not looking to maintain that previous identity before you incarnated in. So it's like you can't have it both ways, basically. You have to kind of let go of that particular, role, or that you can understand your origin and embrace it. But you have to understand that within that particular density or dimension you're inhabiting, like it's totally different. There are limitations in that sense. So that was basically what happened. Now, there were incursions that occurred because of this in warfare. There was also mixing with these particular areas in the constellations. And basically, after a certain point in time, the Niberu began to realize that they were no longer immortal, as they were before they created the universe and all its universal laws. So now they themselves were under those universal laws within that universe. And so even though they were at a higher dimension, the social realms were a higher dimension than, let's say, this dimension, they still were under that particular structure. And so they were aging, and they were not immortal as they had once been to that same extent. And so there was this desire to maintain that immortality, to be as they were essentially as gods, but still experience that particular universe. And so this kind of became a trap for them. So they started doing things that they normally wouldn't have done in order to maintain that immortality. So that's where you get a lot of the myths with, it's not really a myth, but the stories of the mining of gold, because gold is very much, it reprograms our DNA, it raises our DNA, it essentially is the road to immortality in the lower dimensions. It increases that capacity for density awareness, it increases the vibration of that person or that being. So that's really what started with that whole thing. And so that's also why, like you see in movies like in, I don't know how many of you have seen on Netflix, there's a movie called The Dark Crystal, and on Netflix there's a show that's like a prequel to Dark Crystal, and it kind of shows how When the Skeksis came, they really, first of all, they weren't like all evil. Like they had basically polarized themselves in that process. They split apart. They were actually light beings, you know, that came down, and they split apart into two divisions of polarities within themselves. And one polarity, which we consider the more negative polarity, was really interested in like dominance, and they wanted to rule because they considered themselves superior because of their immortality and because they're from another higher dimension. And so that whole story is kind of played out in that movie. So when they start aging, they start freaking out, and they're trying to maintain that same level of immortality, and end up doing these atrocities to the indigenous of that particular world. So this story has kind of been retold in different ways throughout history, but that's basically the gist. So now that I kind of got that part out of the way, I want to say that the Anunnaki, not only did the Anunnaki, or I want to say, I'm going to refer to them as Niberu in this case. The Niberu did create this universe, and they also embodied their own creation. And they had, for a very, very, very long time, full memory of that process. I still feel that it's within the DNA of the Niberu, you know, as I'm able, for example, to access it right now. But a lot of them over successive generations and incarnations, like, lost sight of a lot of that. But I digress. So basically, the Anunnaki were also the first to come on to the Earth plane. Not the first of any race, but the first of the celestial realm within the universe to come on to the Earth plane and interact with the beings that had emanated down there. So I want to put that out there. So quickly, I also want to mention that that they told me that there was another universe that they created first before this one. There's been countless universes in the multiverse that have been created, but this particular universe is a recreation of a prior universe that failed, is what they told me. And that universe did reach a point where it had beings on it, like had like the Earth plane existence, and had beings and had these other realms. But just like anything else, you know, they were experiencing being creators out of the void. And so, you know, it was almost like a failed experiment, so to speak, is how they kind of explain it, because they didn't destroy it intentionally. But how they explain it to me, the best way I could explain it in quote-unquote human 3D terms is that it got caught in some kind of a time loop void situation where basically that universe collapsed. So when that happened, they then recreated the one that we're in now. Only it was a much higher density vibration, but I'll get to that probably in a different video. But basically, they created the one that we are in now. So after they embodied the universe, and they were embodying the universe, much later they came into the Earth plane, but they were the ones that created this universe. I just want to make that clear, which is why throughout all these religious texts are always talking about how they're the creators. They're depicted as the creators, and they want to be acknowledged as such. So basically, the first beings that were on this particular plane of existence, which used to be mostly water, were these serpentine-like beings, which some of them do still exist. I'm getting that they exist kind of in an underworld type situation. But I don't mean underworld like the realm of the dead. I mean more like underground, or a different dimension, like within the earth realm. So these beings were serpentine water beings, but over time, as the water started to recede and earth started to appear, these other beings were starting to appear, and they were mostly avian, is what I'm getting. Now, these were the initial beings that the Niberu started experimenting on. Now, this is actually pre-Mu. This is pre-antediluvian time. This is actually before Mu. Now, these particular avian beings were a hominid-like avian being, but they weren't super, the word I'm looking for, they didn't have like a very advanced society. They had reached the point where they knew how to build, like, they had built like these stone hovels, like they knew how to like do basic living and stuff, and gathering, hunting, stuff like that, but they really were not that advanced. So what the Anunnaki did, as I mentioned earlier, they were trying to maintain their immortality, so they came down to mine gold. So when they did this, then they started modifying these beings because they realized they didn't have enough of them, or rather, they felt it would take too long for them to mine it themselves. So they started actually altering the DNA of these beings to make them more, intelligent, to make them better equipped and stronger. But what actually happened is these avian beings were actually not very adept at this. And so what happened is they actually just started multiplying way too fast, and they actually started to starve. And the Niberu kind of let them starve out because they really knew that they needed to kind of create a better type of race in order to mine what they were looking for. So they basically let these beings die down, and then they went in and they started doing further modification to the already modified beings. Now at this point in time, because the Niberu that came down were already successive generations from the original Niberu, who basically became the Council of Nine, the other Niberu, or the Anunnaki, were basically other generations of them, and many of them had mixed in with the indigenous of Orion and Draco and Sirius and Lyra, which is why later the Anunnaki had made council laws that they didn't want mixing, because they didn't want to disturb their bloodline, and they were already really concerned about their own mortality. So I just want to make that clear. But they were still not... they were still okay within their own logic. We were still okay with doing experiments on other beings, using DNA to modify them in order for them to work for us, so that we could get the resources we need to maintain or rediscover our own immortality while in this universe. So I'm just like I said before, I'm going to use we and they interchangeably. So this next race really became more of an amalgamation and became a much stronger race. Now, again, this is somewhat connected to what, like, many would say Madame Blavatsky's channeling work, but a little different, because this is not talking about the root races that began during Mu. This is talking about the races that were before then. So this next racial group was a lot stronger and a lot smarter and a lot more adept. And so they started teaching them to mine, and they really weren't teaching them much of anything else. That came kind of later. But around this time, I want to say other star beings started popping up. Now, this is right around the time of Mu, maybe right before. Other star beings started coming down. Now, what I'm getting is that there were other types of life that were existing on the Earth plane, but the Anunnaki really hadn't began dealing with them. They were trying to find the ones that were the best for what they were trying to do. So, but now that we had these different sects, basically, or different types of sub-races with this initial race that we were experimenting on, now there were these other races that were popping up. And when the other star beings came down, they started also mixing with these races as well. And these were star beings from all the common constellations you hear about: the Pleiades, Andromedans, Arcturians, other Lyrans and Orions, other Dracos. I mean, there were a bunch of races that were basically mixing in dealing with the beings here as well. They started coming down in density. They were curious. They were basically interacting, And so when this was happening, there was different types of beings that were coming up. Some of them were coming up lion-headed, and some of them were coming up. I mean, they looked like these amalgamation of different races because of all this mixing. So this was kind of during the time of early Mu, and this actually continued into Lemuria. Now, the later mixing that many talk about when the Anunnaki started mixing more with mankind, like actually in that sense, like when I say mankind, I'm not talking about the fifth root race that we have right now. I'm talking about the earlier, the Manu, or the beings that had emanated down, the other beings that emanated down. But when they started actually mixing with that race, that was much later. And the Atlanteans themselves, the Lemurian Atlanteans and Atlanteans, because Atlantis came after Lemuria, they also started doing their own modification. So they started modifying other creatures with their DNA, and they created a lot of the fifth root races. Specifically, a lot of the more Caucasian races connect back to that. But we're all modified and we're all hybridized to a degree. So this whole idea that, I mean, even those of us who are Niberu or Anunnaki, or, you know, come down from the Niberu all the way down the Shemitic line to this 3D expression, even we are hybridized, because the Anunnaki did eventually mix their seed directly, not just in modifying, but directly in with our particular racial bloodline, that root race, and they became the Shemitic race. So the Shemitic race can trace themselves all the way back to the void, because the Niberu or the Anunnaki, which the Hebrews also adopt that name because they're part of that bloodline, go all the way back to the void. So that's, I just want to kind of make that clear. So that's what makes us distinct from other cosmic trees and other 3D trees, but we are still hybridized. We're just less hybridized than some of the other races, but we're still very much hybridized, because the Nibiru and other star races did, you know, basically have a hand in the progression of the races on this earth plane, leading up to the races that we are now in the fifth root race. And some of these races still exist underground. I just want to make that clear as well. And others in other dimensions of this earth, and other earth rings. There's rings to this earth as well. So I'll talk about that more in another video. I just wanted to give, this is like a part 1, so I wanted to give kind of like a brief history from the perspective of the Nibiru from the void, going down into the universe they created in the celestial realms, and then coming down to the earth realm and what they were doing here. I'm going to continue that history, and I'm also later on I'm going to do a video on what happened in the celestial wars, like what people will call like the so-called Orion wars, and some of the other incursions that took place. I'm going to touch on that as well. But I just wanted to do like a part 1 of this particular aspect of history from this particular angle. So I will be making more videos. Stay tuned. That was just part 1. Part 2 will be coming. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Take care. Shalom.